Hello, thank you for watching another video. The lesson that I'm going to share with you today is plot versus theme. And if our students are able to discern the difference between plot and theme, they will be able to comprehend at a much higher level. I'm going to continue with Because of Winn-Dixie because it seems to be popular, and it's just a wonderful read aloud for many different reasons. So how I would start this lesson with my students is I would probably refer back to genre and talk about how Because of Winn-Dixie is realistic fiction, and the reason why we know that it's realistic fiction is that it has the characters and a setting and events that are happening. And then I would connect with this idea of the events that are happening are the components of the plot. So I'm going to read the next chapter, and inside of this chapter I'm going to share my thinking of plot versus theme. So chapter 5. Winn-Dixie couldn't stand to be left alone. We found that out real quick. If me and the preacher went off and left him by himself in the trailer, he pulled all the cushions off the couch and all the toilet paper off the roll. So we started tying him up outside with a rope when we left. That didn't work either. Winn-Dixie howled until Samuel, Mrs. Detweller's dog, started howling too. It was exactly the kind of noise that people in an all-adult trailer park do not like to hear. He doesn't want to be left alone, I told the preacher. That's all. Let's take him with us. I could understand the way Winn-Dixie felt. Getting left behind probably made his heart feel empty. After a while, the preacher gave in, and everywhere we went, we took Winn-Dixie, even to church. The Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi isn't a regular-looking church. The building used to be a Picket Quick store, and when you walk in the front door, the first thing you see is the Picket Quick motto. It's written on the floor in little tiny red tiles that make great big letters that say, "Pick, pick, pick, quick, quick, quick." The preacher tried painting over those tiles, but the letters won't stay covered, and so the preacher has just given up and let them be. The other thing about the Open Arms is that is different from other churches is there aren't any pews. People bring in their own fold-up chairs and lawn chairs, and so sometimes it looks more like a congregation is watching a parade or sitting at a barbecue instead of being at church. It's kind of a strange church, and I thought Winn-Dixie would fit right in. But the first time we brought Winn-Dixie to the Open Arms, the preacher tied him up outside the front door. Why did we bring him all the way here just to tie him up? I asked the preacher. Because dogs don't belong in church, Opal, the preacher said. That's why. He tied Winn-Dixie up to a tree and said how there was lots of shade for him and that it ought to work out real good. Well, it didn't. The service started, and there was some singing and some sharing and some praying, and then the preacher started preaching, and then he wasn't but 2 or 3 words into his sermon when there was a terrible howl coming from outside. The preacher tried to ignore it. "Today," he said. "Awoo," said Winn-Dixie. "Please," said the preacher. "Awoo," said Winn-Dixie back. "Friends," said the preacher. "Awoo," wailed Winn-Dixie. Everyone turned in their lawn chairs and folded up chairs and looked at one another. "Opal," said the preacher. "Awoo," said Winn-Dixie. "Yes, sir," I said. "Go get that dog," he yelled. "Yes, sir," I yelled back. I went outside and untied Winn-Dixie and brought him inside, and he sat down beside me and smiled up at the preacher, and the preacher couldn't help it. He smiled back. Winn-Dixie had that effect on him. And so the preacher started in preaching again. Winn-Dixie sat there listening to it, wiggling his ears this way and that, trying to catch all the words, and everything would have been all right, except that a mouse ran across the floor. The Open Arms had mice. They were there from when it was a Picket Quick, and there were lots of good things to eat in the building. And when the Picket Quick became the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi, the mice stayed around to eat all the leftover crumbs from the potluck suppers. The preacher kept on saying he was going to have to do something about them, but he never did. Because the truth is, he couldn't stand the thought of hurting anything, even a mouse. Well, Winn-Dixie saw that mouse and he was up and after him. One minute everything was quiet and serious and the preacher was going on. And the next minute, Winn-Dixie looked like a fury bullet shooting across the building, chasing the mouse. He was barking and his feet were skidding all over the polished picket quick floor. And people were clapping and hollering and pointing. They really went wild when Winn-Dixie actually caught the mouse. "I have never in all my life seen a dog catch a mouse," said Mrs. Nordley. She was sitting next to me. "He's a special dog," I told her. "I imagine so," she said back. Winn-Dixie stood up there in front of the whole church, wagging his tail and holding the mouse real careful in his mouth, holding on to him tight, but not squishing him. "I believe that mutt has got some retriever in him," said somebody from behind. "That's a hunting dog." Winn-Dixie took the mouse over to the preacher and dropped it at his feet. And when the mouse tried to get away, Winn-Dixie put his paw right on the mouse's tail. Then he smiled up at the preacher. He showed him all his teeth. The preacher looked down at the mouse. He looked at Winn-Dixie. He looked at me. He rubbed his nose. It got real quiet in the picket quick. "Let us pray," the preacher finally said, "for this mouse." And everybody started laughing and clapping. The preacher picked up the mouse by the tail and walked and threw it out the front door of the picket quick. And everybody applauded again. Then he came back, and when they all prayed together. I prayed for Mama. I told God how much she would have enjoyed hearing the story of Winn-Dixie catching that mouse. It would have made her laugh. I asked God if maybe I could be one to tell her the story someday, the one to tell her the story. And then I talked to God about how I was lonely in Naomi because I didn't know that many kids, only the ones from church. And there weren't that many kids in the open arms, just Dunlap and Stevie Dewberry, two boys who weren't twins but looked very much alike. And Amanda Wilkinson, whose face was always pinched up like she was smelling something real bad. And Sweetie Pie Thomas, who was only 5 years old and still mostly a baby. And none of them wanted to be my friend anyway because they probably thought I'd tell on them to the preacher for every little thing they did wrong. And then they would get in trouble with God and their parents. So I told God that I was lonely, even having Winn-Dixie. And finally, I prayed for the mouse. Like the preacher suggested, I prayed that he didn't get hurt when he went flying out the door of the Open Arms Baptist Church in Naomi. I prayed that he landed on a nice soft patch of grass. So as I'm reading this chapter, I'm thinking about the plot versus the theme. The plot is everything that has happened, all the little pieces. So we know in the beginning of the chapter, we learn that Winn-Dixie doesn't like to stay home. And then we learn that Sweet Opal says we should bring Winn-Dixie with us everywhere because he doesn't like to stay home. So then they bring him to church, and we learn this wonderful story about how at first the preacher, because dogs aren't allowed in church, that Winn-Dixie has to stay outside. But Winn-Dixie doesn't like it, so Winn-Dixie makes a lot of noise and he gets inside the church. And then there's a mouse, and Winn-Dixie gets the mouse, and everyone is very happy because nobody really wants to have the mice. And also, Winn-Dixie doesn't even hurt the mouse. He just gives the mouse to the preacher, and the preacher then gets rid of the mouse out the front door. That's the plot. Those are the events that happen, the sequential events, everything that takes place that makes us interested in the story. The theme is what the author wants us to think about, the main message, the empathy that we might feel for a character. So themes are emerging inside of this book. And when I look at how it talks about how Opal says he doesn't want to be left alone. So I take that little piece. And then I read here how Opal's not happy that he's tied up outside. And then I read how Winn-Dixie is able to come inside the church and how Opal literally says he's a special dog to the lady that's there in the church. And then I keep reading through how Winn-Dixie smiles at the preacher. So I believe what the author wants us to think about, the theme, one of the themes of this book is love. Because all of these things that the characters are doing and saying is showing love for each other. How Opal loves Winn-Dixie, and how the preacher actually loves Winn-Dixie very much too. It literally says it in there that he loves Winn-Dixie as well. And how the preacher finally lets Winn-Dixie come inside of the church because he loves Winn-Dixie and doesn't want Winn-Dixie to be howling and to be sad. And it goes on for us to know how much he appreciates and loves Winn-Dixie, because when Winn-Dixie gives him the mouse, that he said, and let us pray for the mouse. So all of these events that make the plot, when we piece them all together, that's the message. When I walk away from this book, I am thinking about the plot, but then when I really settle down and think about the plot, I switch to more thinking about the theme, the message, and I think about the love that this book is really portraying. And I believe that the author has written this book because the author wants us to think about how we treat our loved ones and how we use words towards our loved ones, and how our actions are showing our love to the people that are around us, and that we say that we're loved. And I think Opal is a character that we can learn from, that big idea, that message of if we really love someone, then we need to take care of that someone. And Opal showed that by saying he doesn't want to be left at home. He's lonely, so we have to bring him with us. And then even Opal was an advocate for him when he was left outside of the church. And so when he was brought in, she made sure to let everyone know he's a special dog. Yes, he is. He really, truly is very special. So plot versus theme. Plot are the events that help us to understand what's taking place in the story. And theme is what we take away from the story that we think about and possibly then relate to our own lives. So that theme of love, I think about my own family, and I think about how do I use words that show love, and how do my actions show love to my children and to my own dog. Thank you so much for watching another video, and please do take care.